Somewhere around 3000 BC, something changed. The gods who once walked with kings, who chose rulers and destroyed cities, stopped showing up. The old writings don't tell us why. They just stop talking about gods being present and start talking about remembering them. What you're about to hear isn't a guess about aliens from space. It's a question the facts keep asking. What happened at the beginning of history that made the old way of doing things fall apart? The Sumerian king list talks about rulers who ruled for 28,800 years, then 36,000 years, then 43,200 years. 8 kings total ruling for 241,200 years before the Great Flood. After the flood, the same paper lists kings who ruled for tens of years, not thousands. Same writer, same businesslike tone, same clay tablet. But here's what makes this list really disturbing. It doesn't talk about the flood as punishment for people doing bad things. It talks about it as a reset, a try at solving a problem with managing things. And the problem was us. Humans had become too many, too noisy, too wild. The Epic of Atrahasis says it clearly. The gods couldn't sleep because humans had grown beyond control. This isn't a creation story. It's a record of failing to manage things. What if the disappearance of the Anunnaki from history writings isn't about leaving us behind, but about everything falling apart? What if humans didn't lose the gods? What if the gods lost us? The facts for this aren't hidden. They've been sitting in museums, colleges, and old object storage places for over 100 years. The World Blundell Prism, a four-sided clay block no bigger than a book today, was dug up in 1922 from the ruins of Larsa in southern Iraq. When smart people translated its wedge-shaped writing, they found something that still bothers historians today. The king lists that 3 story characters and proven real rulers with the same exact careful record-keeping style. The list starts with a sentence that modern people who study old things struggle to understand. After the kingship came down from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names 8 kings Alulim, Alalgar, Imeluana, and 5 others who ruled from 5 different cities, for a total of over 241,000 years. Then comes one sentence. Then the flood swept over. And then the list continues. It names new kings and new cities. But now the reigns get smaller, a few hundred years, then tens of years, then lengths that match what people who dig up old things have found. Most famously, it lists Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a person whose city walls have been physically dug up, whose name appears in many separate sources. His reign smart people date to around 2700 BC. So, here's the problem. If the after-flood section is really true to history, why do we say the before-flood section doesn't matter? Same paper, same writer, same matter-of-fact tone. No change in writing style, no warning that says what follows is just symbolic. Just names, cities, and numbers. If you enjoy history mysteries that question mainstream timelines, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And as always, the pictures are here to add context. The real facts lie in ancient history. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Let's go back to 1922. Herbert Weld Blundell's team is digging up Larsa, one of ancient Sumer's most important cities. Among the broken pieces, they find a small clay prism covered in tightly packed cuneiform. When it's translated, smart people expect the usual grain receipts, tax records, religious songs. Instead, they get a record book of kingship. The style is businesslike. No fancy poetry, no story framing, just names, cities, reign lengths, and totals. The writer writes like an accountant, not a storyteller. And that's what makes the content so shocking, because the numbers are impossible. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar, for 36,000 years. The third, Imeluana, for 43,200 years. The list continues through 8 kings, each ruling for tens of thousands of years. At the end of this section, the writer provides a total 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. The immediate smart person response was dismissal. Obviously story-like, symbolic reign lengths representing time periods, not individuals. The list was put away as a creation story. Interesting, but not important to real history. Except the list doesn't stop at the flood. It picks up immediately afterward. New kings, new cities. And now the numbers change. After flood reigns drop to a few hundred years, then a century, then tens of years. Suddenly the list enters a range that digging up old things can prove. This is where the puzzle becomes impossible to escape. The after-flood section includes rulers we know existed. Gilgamesh isn't just a story character. He's mentioned in the Sumerian king list, the Epic of Gilgamesh, business papers from Uruk, and separate Sumerian poems. His city's walls have been dug up. He was real. So if Gilgamesh is real and he appears in the same paper written in the same style by the same writing tradition that lists Alulim and his 28,800-year reign, what exactly are we saying doesn't matter? The Sumerian writers didn't separate story kings from real kings. They showed one continuous line broken only by the flood. To accept half the paper as true and reject the other half as meditative requires cutting the text in two and choosing which piece to believe. But there's something even stranger buried in those numbers. They are at random. The Sumerians used a BASC-60 math system. Their largest time unit was the SAR, equal to 3,600 years. Now look at the before flood rains again. Alulum 28,800 years equals 8 SARs. Alulgar 36,000 years equals 10 SARs. In Meluana, 43,200 years equals 12 SARs. Every rain is an exact multiple of 3,600. This isn't making things bigger than they are. It's math. The writers were recording something they believed followed an ordered system, which gives us two possibilities. First, the numbers are symbolic. They represent time periods, family lines, or space cycles. But if so, why attach them to specific named individuals who ruled? From specific named cities. Why keep the business-like tone? Why provide running totals? Second possibility, these rulers weren't human in the way we understand the term. The list itself offers a clue in its opening line after the kingship came down from heaven. For the Sumerians, political power wasn't invented by humans. It was delivered from outside, from above. Kingship was a system that came to earth. And according to the writings, it didn't stay forever. Because here's what the king list actually records: the gradual collapse of a system. Early rulers reigned for thousands of years. Later rulers reigned for hundreds of years. After flood, rulers reigned for tens of years. The pattern isn't story-like decay. It's loss of control. And the flood isn't shown as God punishment for human badness. In the Atrahasis epic, which matches the king list timeline, the flood is clearly described as a population control measure. The gods were overwhelmed. Humans had multiplied. The noise was unbearable. Plagues didn't work. Hunger didn't work. So the gods tried one final reset, and it failed. Humans survived, rebuilt, multiplied again, and this time the gods didn't return to rule. Kingship remained on earth, managed by humans, made legitimate through ritual and memory rather than presence. The Sumerian king list doesn't describe leaving us behind. It describes a transfer of power permanent, can't be reversed. So the question isn't whether the Anunnaki were real. The question is what's kept in these writings: a memory of God's rule, or a memory of rule by someone that humans eventually outgrew, fought against, or outlasted. Let's start where the texts start, with kingship coming down from heaven, and the very first signs that the system was never going to last. Chapter 1: The disappearance at the top of history. In the British Museum, catalogue number K3473, sits a clay tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. It's a broken piece of the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating to the 7th century BC. On it, Gilgamesh speaks with Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the man the gods gave immortality after the flood. And Utnapishtim tells him something that defines the entire after-flood world: there is no permanence. The sleeping and the dead, how like they are. That's not a moral lesson. It's a diagnosis. The age of permanence of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, of gods who walked through cities, was over, and it wasn't coming back. The question historians rarely ask is simple: why? If we treat the early Mesopotamian writings as pure stories, the question doesn't matter. Stories don't need explanations. They're symbolic. But if we treat them the way the writers did, as records, as timelines, as real political history, then something amazing happened between 3000 and 2000 BC. The gods stopped ruling directly, and humans took over. Not through fighting back, not through war, through something quieter and far more permanent: transfer. Look at the pattern kept across multiple sources. The Sumerian king list isn't alone. The Uridu Genesis, another Sumerian creation text, describes the same order. Cities founded by God command, kingship established, humans multiplying, God frustration growing, and finally the flood, after which the tone shifts. Gods remain in the background, but they no longer choose kings personally. They no longer come down to settle arguments. They give instructions through signs, dreams, and priests. The Epic of Atrahasis goes further. It clearly describes the before-flood world as a system under stress. The gods created humans to do work. But humans reproduce beyond predictions. The noise the text uses, the word rigmu, meaning noise or uproar, became unbearable. The gods tried corrections: plague, drought, famine. None worked. Population bounced back. So they allowed the flood. And after the flood, the system changed permanently. This isn't religious evolution. It's organization collapse written down in real time across multiple separate writings. The gods don't vanish suddenly. They fade. First from direct rule, then from physical presence, then from active help. What remains are temples, rituals, and the priesthood organizations that go between an increasingly distant god order and an increasingly independent human one. The Gingipal things facts support the writing pattern. Early Sumerian cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur weren't just population centers. They were temple groups. Massive ziggurats dominated the skyline. Business tablets from these sites record grain handouts, work assignments, and ritual schedules managed by temple officials. The early city wasn't non-religious. It was religion-ruled. The temple was the state. But by the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BC, the balance shifts. Royal palaces appear alongside temples. Kings begin to claim power separately from priest approval. Writings from this period no longer say the god Enlil commanded me to build this. They say, I, King so-and-so, built this for the god Enlil. Subtle, but the grammar matters. Power has transferred. Even the king list confirms this. After flood, families compete. Cities rise and fall. Kingship moves from Kish to Ur-Tur, not because heaven commands it, but because armies enforce it. The phrase kingship came down from heaven becomes a king-legitimate formula, not a description of actual god appointment. So here's the central mystery: if God's rule was a working system for thousands of years, even symbolically, what made it not work anymore? Three possibilities appear from the writings themselves. First, population growth. Atrahasis states it clearly: humans became too many. But too many for what? For the work system, for giving out resources, for the centralized control required by early irrigation-based city-states. The text doesn't say. It just says the gods couldn't tolerate the size. Second, environment pressure. The flood traditions aren't Madup everywhere fantasies. Mesopotamia experienced terrible flooding regularly. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable, and early cities were built on flood areas. Digging things digs at Uruk and Shuruppak have uncovered clear flood layers, dating to the early 3rd millennium BC, not a worldwide flood, but local disasters severe enough to destroy cities and disrupt political continuity. Third, the writings themselves hint at internal god conflict. The Atrahasis epic describes disagreement among the gods. Enlil wants to destroy humans. Enki wants to keep them. The solution to flood is a compromise that satisfies no one. Afterward, the gods retreat. Not in defeat, but in frustration. The system didn't work. The project failed. But failed how and failed for whom? Because the strange thing about the flood stories is this: humans survive, rebuild, spread faster than before. The flood was supposed to be a reset, a return to manageable numbers and obedient behavior. Instead, it becomes the dividing line between two worlds. Before God presence. After God memory. The writings keep this shift with paper-like precision. Before flood, kings have impossible reigns and direct God backing. After flood, kings have believable reigns and inherited right to rule. Before flood, power comes down from heaven. After flood, power is fought over, earned, or taken. And nowhere in the later records does kingship ever come down from heaven again. That's not stories fading into history. That's a system collapsing and never being fixed. So the earliest Mesopotamian records keep, whether really or symbolically, an age when God power was immediate, physical, and unavoidable. What's the first sign that control was slipping? The answer is written in the reigns themselves. And the pattern is unmistakable. Chapter 2: Kingship comes down, then starts shrinking. The well-Blundell prism isn't the only copy of the Sumerian king list. At least 18 broken versions have been found from sites across Mesopotamia: Nippur, Larsa, Isin, Babylon. Some are older, some newer. Some include different kings or different reign lengths, but they all keep the same basic structure: before flood, kings with impossibly long reigns, the flood, then after flood, kings with shorter reigns. This wasn't accidental. The king list was copied, edited, and updated for over 1,000 years, from roughly 2100 BC through the first 1,000 years BC. Writers didn't keep it because it was ancient curiosity. They kept it because it was politically useful. King lists weren't history in the modern sense. They were writerly papers, a tool for proving that your family, your city, your claim to power stood in unbroken line from the moment kingship first came down from heaven. To be included in the list was to be recognized. To be left out was to be erased. That's why different versions exist. Each city-state, each family, each royal writer shaped the list to support their boss's authority. If your king conquered a rival city, you might put his name into the order and remove theirs. If you wanted to claim God favor, you emphasized continuity with earlier rulers. The list was a living political tool, not a fixed record. But here's what makes the list so strange: despite all the editing, all the competing versions, all the political reasons, the before flood section remains almost identical across every copy. 8 kings, 5 cities, reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, the flood, then the dramatic shift. Why keep that section at all? If the list's purpose was writeral, why begin with kings no one could prove? Why anchor your political power in people whose reigns were, by any human measure, ridiculous? The answer lies in the opening phrase: after the kingship came down from heaven. For the Mesopotamians, kingship wasn't invented. It was delivered. The system came from outside, complete and intact, carrying God power built into its very structure. To claim kingship was to claim participation in that original coming down. The before flood section wasn't unimportant. It was the foundation. Without it, kingship became just another human organization. With it, every king ruled as heir to a system older than cities, older than writing, older than the flood itself. But the list does something else, something no political paper should do if its only goal is writeral. It shows the system getting worse. Look at the numbers carefully. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, rules for 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar, for 36,000. The third, Inemuana, for 43,200. These aren't just large numbers. They're perfectly mathematical. Each is a multiple of the Sumerian Sar, the 3,600-year unit. The pattern holds through all 8 before a flood. Kings. Then the flood, and when kingship starts again, the numbers collapse. The first after-flood family Akish includes kings who rule for 1,200 years, then 960, then 670. Still impossibly long by human standards, but a fraction of what came before. Move forward through the list and reigns continue shrinking. By the time you reach the first family of Uruk, kings rule for 420 years, then 324, then 305. Then Gilgamesh appears. His reign 126 years. Still unbelievable, but approaching the edge of possibility. And after Gilgamesh, the reigns drop further tens of years, single-digit multiples of the Sar. By the time the list reaches families people who dig up all things can prove separately, reign links match known real timelines almost exactly. This pattern, this gradual mathematical shrinking suggests something more deliberate than story-like decay. It reads like a thermometer measuring not time but distance. Distance from the original source of power, distance from heaven. The Sumerian writers use BASC 60 math for everything: astronomy, economics, land measurement, and apparently political right rule. If you read the reign lengths as hidden belief rather than real years, a picture appears. Early kingship was stable, unified, God-sourced. Later kingship became broken up, fought over, mortal. But why hide it this way? Why not just say the gods ruled, then humans ruled? Why keep the business-like tone, the exact numbers, the running totals? Because to admit the break openly would undermine the entire system. Kings couldn't say, we used to have God governors, but they left. That would invite the obvious question: then why should anyone obey you? Instead, they kept continuity. Same organization, same list, same writer rule, just adjusted over time. Smart people treat this with extreme caution, and rightly so. No mainstream historian claims Alulim really ruled for 28,800 years. The before flood section is understood by everyone as story-like, symbolic, or belief-based. But the list itself never shifts tone. It never warns you when story ends and history begins. The writer who recorded Alulim's 28,800-year reign used the same formula, the same grammar, the same business-like precision he used to record Gilgamesh's 126-year reign. Both are shown as facts, which forces us back to the central problem. The list records a transition from one kind of kingship to another, from one kind of world to another. And the transition isn't smooth. It's terrible. The flood doesn't just interrupt the order. It shatters the entire scale. After the flood, kingship starts again, but it never recovers its original length. The numbers keep shrinking. Power keeps breaking up. Cities compete rather than cooperate. And nowhere in the after-flood section does the list ever say kingship came down from heaven again. It came down once, then it stayed, then it decayed. So here's the question the list itself demands: if the reigns shrink because the world is changing, because humans are taking over, because God's presence is fading, because the old system no longer works, what event forces that change? Nature, politics, or something the writings describe, but we've learned not to take seriously? The answer begins in the most disturbing section of the Mesopotamian collection, the moment the gods realize humans have become unmanageable. Chapter 3: The Management Crisis when Humans Become Too Many. In 1965, a team of smart people published a complete translation of an old Babylonian tablet catalogued as British Museum 78941. It contained one of the most complete versions of the Atrahasis epic, a creation story older than the biblical Genesis, written sometime around 1800 BC, but keeping oral traditions that likely stretch back hundreds of years earlier. The text opens not with God majesty, but with God work argument. Before humans existed, the gods themselves did the work of civilization. They dug canals. They dredged rivers. They maintained irrigation systems. For 40 years, the lesser gods, the Igigi, worked under the command of the senior gods, the Anunnaki. Then the Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief god, and refused to continue. The solution was humans. The gods created humans specifically to take over the work, not as a gift, as a replacement workforce. The text is blunt about this: let man assume the drudgery of God. Humans were designed, bred, and put to work to perform tasks the God order could no longer sustain internally. It's a creation story, yes, but framed as a business reorganization. And for a time, the system worked. But then humans did what all populations do when conditions allow: they multiplied. The Atrahasis epic describes this with medical precision. 1200 years pass. The human population grows. And then comes a line that defines the entire crisis: the land became wide. The people became numerous. The land bellowed like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, the noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. The word used is rigma, noise, clamor, uproar. Modern translations soften it to disturbance, but the Akkadian carries something harsher, unbearable, wild sound. Not the productive hum of civilization, but the din of something out of control. Enlil's response isn't anger. It's irritation born of managing failure. Humans have exceeded predictions. The workforce has grown beyond the system's capacity to manage it. And the gods, at least according to the text, have no way to scale their rule. So they put in place corrective measures. First, plague. The gods send disease to reduce the population. But the text says that the god Enki, who created humans, steps in. He tells humans to focus worship on Namtar, the plague god, and the sickness stops. The population recovers. Second, drought. The gods hold back rain. Crops fail. Hunger spreads. Again, Enki steps in. He teaches humans to redirect worship to Adad, the storm god. The rains return. The population bounces back. Third, total environment collapse. The gods cut off all food sources. No rain, no river flooding, no growth. For 6 years, the text says, hunger gets worse. People resort to cannibalism. Mothers eat their children. But still some survive, and when conditions normalize, humans multiply again. Finally, the gods allow the flood not as punishment for badness. The text never accuses humans of moral failure. The flood is a population control measure, a reset, the final solution to a managing crisis that grew beyond normal tools. Now, here's where the Atrahasis epic becomes something other than story, because the corrective measures it describes plague, famine, resource restriction. Terrible intervention aren't god fantasies. They're the exact pressures early Mesopotamian city-states faced and feared. Documentaries facts from the 3rd millennium BC reveal city centers growing rapidly along the Tigris and Euphrates. Uruk at its height may have housed 50,000 people, a stunning concentration for the time. That kind of density required sophisticated irrigation, constant grain imports, centralized storage, and work coordination on a scale never before attempted. And it was fragile. Irrigation systems filled with silt. Salt made crop yields go down. Floods destroyed infrastructure. Sicknesses spread through crowded areas. Hunger struck when harvests failed. The very systems that allowed cities to grow created weaknesses that could collapse them. The term rigmu, the noise that disturbed the gods, takes on new meaning when you consider what early city planners actually faced: overcrowding, cleanliness failures, resource competition, class tension, and the constant worry that the population had outgrown the state's ability to feed, house, and control it. Atrahasis isn't describing god frustration in the abstract. It's keeping elite anxiety about losing control of the masses. Look at the structure of the solutions. Plague isn't random. It's a tool states understood. Quarantine, expulsion of the sick, and appeals to deities were standard responses. Famine wasn't god caprice. It was the inevitable result of failed harvests, which early states managed through rationing, forced work on public projects, and appeals to weather gods. Even the flood fits. Mesopotamian cities were built on flood areas. Terrible flooding was a known returning disaster. The Documentaries record keeps flood layers at Ur, Sharapak, and Kish, dating to the early 3rd millennium BC, local, but devastating events that destroyed settlements and forced populations to rebuild. But here's what the Atrahasis epic admits: that no political paper, but none of the corrective measures worked permanently. Plague stops, famine ends, populations recover, and each time humans return stronger, more numerous, more unmanageable than before. The gods couldn't scale their role to match human reproduction. And that's the core of the crisis kept in the text: not human fighting back, not moral corruption, but system failure. The god order, or whatever political reality the god order represented, couldn't adapt to exponential growth. Every solution was temporary. Every intervention failed to restore the original balance. So they allowed the flood, the ultimate reset, the measure designed not to reduce population, but to erase it almost entirely, and start over with a controlled sample. And the text describes it succeeding. The flood comes. Humans are wiped out except for Atrahasis, the flood hero who survives by building a boat on Enki's secret instruction. But then the epic does something strange. After the flood, the gods don't take back total control. Instead, they negotiate. Enlil is furious that humans survived at all. But Enki defends his decision. The compromise is reached. Humans will be allowed to continue, but with new limitations. Women will experience miscarriage and infertility. There will be classes of women forbidden to bear children. Death will come earlier. In other words, the gods put in place biological population controls because business controls failed. And then the text ends. Humans continue. The gods withdraw into the background. The system never returns to its before-flood state. So here's the question the Atrahasis epic forces us to face: if the stories describe growing control measures, plague, famine, environment collapse, and finally the flood, why does the final measure fail to restore permanent god rule? Why do the gods retreat instead of rebuilding the system? The answer may be written in layers of mud deposited across southern Mesopotamia around 2900 BC, and in the cities that rose from those layers stronger, more independent, and more ungovernable than ever before. Chapter 5. After the waters, kings rule without heaven. The Blau monuments, a pair of carved stone slabs dating to about 3200 BC, show a scene that would become the template for Mesopotamian royal imagery for the next 3000 years. On one side, a king performing ritual. On the other, prisoners bound and defeated. Between them, business symbols, tribute tallies, and god emblems. But there's something missing from the image that would have been present in earlier traditions. No god appears, handing the king his power. No god figure towers over the scene, making the ruler legitimate. The king stands alone, performing the ritual himself, claiming the victory himself, running the state himself. The gods are implied but not present. This shift from god presence to god implication defines the entire after-flood political landscape, and the Sumerian king list records the transition with businesslike precision. After the lion the flood swept over, the list starts again after. The flood had swept over, and the kingship had come down from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. Kingship comes down again, but this time it doesn't stay in one city under god management. It moves. Kish holds it for 23 kings. Then it transfers to Ina, then then Kish again, then Humazi. The pattern continues. Kingship is a fought-over prize, passed through conquest, claimed by competing families, made legitimate after the fact through inclusion in the list. And the reign lengths tell the same story of breaking up. The first after-flood king, Gar of Kish, rules for 1,200 years according to the list. Still story long, but a fraction of the before-flood spans. His successor, Gullanidabonapid, rules for 960 years, then Zukakub for 900. The numbers continue shrinking through the first family of Kish, until they reach almost believable ranges: 120 years, 140 years, 305 years. By the time the list reaches the first family of Uruk, we encounter figures whose reigns digestible things can begin to understand. Mishkangasha rules for 324 years. Still impossible, but the list now puts him in a city whose extensive ruins have been dug up, whose pottery can be dated, whose business tablets keep real economic transactions. Then comes his son, Enmerkar, reign 420 years. Then, Lugalbanda 1,200 years. Then Dumizid 100 years. And then Gilgamesh 126 years. Gilgamesh is the hinge. He appears in the Sumerian king list, in separate Sumerian poems, in business texts from Uruk, and in the epic that bears his name. Smart people debate whether he was a single real king or combined figure. But the city he ruled, Uruk, was unquestionably real. Its walls, temples, and ziggurats have been dug up. Its layers match the periods the king list describes. After Gilgamesh, the list continues through families at Ur, Lagash, and other cities. Reign lengths drop to tens of years, then single years. The story dissolves into the real. By the time we reach the third family of Ur around 2100 BC, we're in fully documented history: kings whose writings survive, whose building projects can be traced, whose wars and treaties are recorded in many separate sources. But here's the critical detail: none of these after-flood kings ever claimed the gods appointed them directly. They claim God approval. They build temples. They perform rituals. They describe themselves as chosen, favored, or beloved of the gods. But the language shifts. Before flood formulas said, kingship came down from heaven. After flood writings say, may the god Enlil favor my reign, or I built this temple for the goddess Inanna. The grammar changes from passive god action to human initiative blessed by distant god approval. Look at the writings of Urnamu, founder of the third family of Ur. He describes himself as the man chosen in the heart of it, as one who made justice in the land. He claims right rule through God favor, but the actions are his. He builds. He makes laws. He conquers. The gods approve, but they don't rule. This becomes the new model. Kings rule. Priests go between. Gods observe. Temples become the primary connection between human and god power. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was an economic powerhouse. Temple groups controlled vast farming lands, employed thousands of workers, stored grain surpluses, and gave out rations. Business tablets from Uruk and Lagash keep careful records: barley handouts, work assignments, festival expenses, offerings to deities. The priesthood ran this system. They interpreted omens. They performed divination. They declared which days were favorable for military campaigns, which months required purification rituals, which dreams signaled god displeasure. But notice what's missing: direct god instruction. The gods no longer speak plainly. They communicate through signs that require expert interpretation: a liver's discoloration, the flight pattern of birds, the shape of smoke rising from incense, dreams requiring trained writers to decode. This isn't a relationship of immediate presence. It's a relationship of organizational go-between. And that go-between served multiple political functions. For kings, it provided right rule without responsibility. If the gods spoke only through omens, a king could claim god favor when convenient, and blame priests' misinterpretation when policies failed. For priests, it secured organizational power. Only they could access God will. Only they could determine what the signs meant. For the people, well, the writings rarely keep what the people thought. But the system worked. For over 2,000 years, Mesopotamian civilization operated on this model: human kings ruling human cities under the symbolic oversight of distant gods, gone between through professional priesthoods and ritualized organizations. The old world, the one where gods came down, walked among cities, chose rulers personally, and ruled directly, became memory, then tradition, then theology. Meanwhile, the political reality evolved in the opposite direction. City-states competed. Families rose through military strength. Empires formed through conquest. Hammurabi of Babylon didn't claim the gods gave him his throne. He claimed the gods gave him the law code to run his conquered territories justly. It's a subtle but total reversal. Before flood, gods rule, humans obey. After flood, humans rule, gods make legitimate. And that raises a question the writings never address directly, but hinted constantly: who actually benefited from the silence of the gods? Did kings benefit freed from direct god oversight to pursue conquest and consolidation? Did priests benefit gaining monopoly control over access to god communication? Or did the people benefit no longer subject to the terrible population controls the Atrahasis epic describes? Or perhaps the question should be framed differently: who lost when the gods went silent? Because if God rule was a real system, political, social, or otherwise, then its collapse would have created both winners and losers. The after-flood world wasn't just different. It was fought over, broken up, violent. The king list itself keeps this. Families don't transition peacefully, they're overthrown. Cities don't cooperate, they conquer each other. Kingship doesn't come down anymore, it's taken. So if heaven became gone between through organizations, if God presence became priest interpretation, if immediate power became symbolic ritual, then the after-flood world represents not just survival but transformation. Humans didn't just outlast the gods. Humans replaced them. But the writings hint at something else, something that complicates the neat story of human triumph. Because even as kingship became human-centered, even as priests went between God will, even as cities competed independently, the stories themselves kept memories of conflict among the gods, wars in heaven that mirrored wars on earth. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Chapter 6: Divine Wars, when the gods start fighting each other. In 1849, British personifiable things Austin Henry Layard dug up the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and found a set of 7 clay tablets covered in Akkadian cuneiform. When assembled and translated, they form the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. The text dates to about 1100 BC, though it likely keeps much older oral traditions. It opens not with peace but with primordial conflict. Before the world existed, there were only 2 beings: Asu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean. They mingled their waters and gave birth to the first gods. But these younger gods were noisy, restless, and disruptive. Asu grew irritated and decided to destroy them. Tiamat initially resisted but eventually agreed. The younger gods discovered the plot. The god of wisdom, killed Asu. Tiamat, enraged by her partner's death, prepared for war. She created 11 monster serpents, dragons, and demon creatures and appointed Kingu, her new partner, as commander. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies, the object that gave supreme power over the cosmos. The gods panicked. None could stand against Tiamat until Marduk, son of E, offered to fight her, but only if the gods agreed to make him their permanent king. They agreed. Marduk defeated Tiamat, split her body in half, and used the pieces to create the heavens and the earth. He took the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu. He reorganized the cosmos, assigned the gods their roles, and established Babylon as the center of god power. The epic ends with the gods proclaiming Marduk's 50 names, each representing an aspect of his total rule. Now, here's what makes the Enuma Elish more than story: it's clearly political propaganda. The text was recited annually during the Babylonian New Year festival, Akitu, at the height of Babylon's imperial power. It made Marduk's supremacy over older Sumerian deities like Enlil and Anu legitimate. It justified Babylon's control over rival cities, and it reframed cosmic order to reflect current political hierarchy. Smart people widely recognize this. The Enuma Elish isn't ancient theology kept unchanged. It's revised theology created to support Babylonian imperialism. Marduk wasn't originally the supreme god. He was raised to that position in text to mirror Babylon's rise politically. But here's the tension: if the Enuma Elish is propaganda, what does it tell us? That the propaganda makers felt the need to frame cosmic power as fought over, violent, and unstable. Why not write a creation epic where Marduk was always supreme? Why keep the story of conflict, overthrow, and regime change in heaven? Because the human audience would have recognized the pattern. They lived it. Mesopotamian political history from 3000 to 1000 BC is a continuous cycle of city-states rising, conquering neighbors, forming empires, collapsing, and being replaced. Kish dominates. Then Uruk. Uruk falls, Ur rises, collapses. Akkad conquers. Akkad breaks up. Babylon consolidates. Babylon falls. Assyria expands. Each transition required making legitimate The new regime couldn't just say, "We won. Obey us." They needed cosmic justification. So they rewrote the god hierarchy to match the new political order. When Babylon rose, Marduk became supreme. When Assyria dominated, Ashur took priority. When different cities controlled trade routes, temple theologies shifted. To reflect economic realities. The gods didn't fight because theology required it. Theology required it because the gods had to mirror the broken up, competitive, constantly shifting political landscape of Mesopotamia itself. But the god conflict stories go deeper than simple comparison. The Enuma Elish describes the Tablet of Destinies, the Me in Sumerian tradition, as the object that grants absolute power. Whoever holds it controls reality itself. Marduk takes it from Kingu. In other stories, Zu, a bird demon, steals it from Enlil, triggering cosmic crisis until Ninurta recovers it. The Me are abstract concepts. They're described as physical objects, tablets, decrees, principles that must be possessed to maintain order and are constantly at risk of being stolen, lost, or transferred. This isn't metaphor. It's political reality written as cosmology. Real Mesopotamian kingship depended on physical symbols of power: crowns, scepters, carved tablets, captured enemy standards. When Hammurabi conquered a city, he didn't just occupy it. He took its god statues and brought them to Babylon. The gods themselves became spoils of war. Their power transferred through physical possession. God wars in the stories mirror human wars on the ground. Territory fought over in heaven reflected territory fought over on earth. And the rightful crisis described in creation epics paralleled the rightful crisis faced by every new family that takes power through force. So when the Enuma Elish describes Tiamat creating monsters to challenge the younger gods, when it shows Marduk reorganizing the cosmos after violent victory, when it shows God power being taken rather than inherited, it's keeping a memory of instability at the foundation of order. But here's where the analysis becomes more complex. If God conflict is purely symbolic, a story device to make human political transitions legitimate, why do the conflicts grow? Why do the stories describe not just rivalry but existential wars? Why frame cosmic order as something that had to be won rather than established? The Atrahasis epic describes gods rebelling against work. The Enuma Elish describes gods warring for supremacy. The Epic of Anzut describes god power being stolen. Across multiple separate writings, the god realm is unstable, fought over, and prone to collapse. Mainstream smart person thinking explains this as projection. Humans experience political instability and project it onto the gods. God wars are human wars written large. Cosmic conflicts are city-state conflicts turned into stories. But the writings themselves resist that easy reduction, because in every god war story, something is at stake beyond symbolism. The younger gods don't just want power, they want freedom from work. Marduk doesn't just want kingship, he wants permanent power that can't be challenged. The conflicts aren't cyclical, they're progressive. Each war results in reorganization, not repetition. And that progression matches the real pattern. Early Sumerian theology describes a council of gods talking collectively. Later Babylonian theology describes a single supreme god delegating power. Early writings show God rule as consensus-based. Later writings show it as hierarchical and centralized. The god order doesn't just mirror human political evolution, it tracks it. As human states centralize, God hierarchy centralized. As human kingship became absolute, God kingship became absolute. As human power required military enforcement, God power required cosmic warfare. Which raises the unsettling possibility: what if the God wars aren't just comparisons for human conflicts, but memories of actual ruling crises among whoever the Anunnaki were? If the Anunnaki were storyized elites, then God wars keep memories of elite group struggles. If they were remembered ruling classes, then God wars keep memories of civil conflicts that broke up centralized control. If they were controversially something else entirely, then God wars keep memories of internal breakdown among non-human overseers. In every interpretation, the pattern holds: power at the top was fought over, unstable, and eventually reorganized under different terms. The gods didn't vanish peacefully. They fought. They broke up. They killed each other. And the survivors reorganized the cosmos, not to restore the old order, but to establish a new one that humans could navigate without constant God intervention. So if God order is being rewritten with every regime change, if cosmic power is shown as violently fought over, if the stories themselves admit the system was unstable from the beginning, does that mean the Anunnaki were always just symbols? Or were they symbols of something that was once real, once present, once ruling until internal conflict made continuation impossible? The answer may lie in the strangest category of writings, the ones that describe humans briefly crossing the boundary between earth and heaven, and then that boundary closing forever. Chapter 7: The Last Bridge, Semitic Iron Kings and the Closing of Heaven. In 1853, Hormizd-Rassam discovered 12 clay tablets in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. When assembled and translated, they formed the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh ever found, a story that had been copied, edited, and passed on across Mesopotamia for nearly 2,000 years. The epic describes Gilgamesh as Tuathar's god, on a third man, a unique formula that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature. Not half divine like Greek heroes Tuathar's. The text emphasizes this repeatedly, as if the precise ratio mattered. And perhaps it did, because Gilgamesh represents the last generation of kings shown as partially divine. After him, the bloodline dilutes. Kingship becomes fully human. And the epic itself tells the story of why that boundary could never be crossed again. The story opens with Gilgamesh as a tyrant, powerful, restless, oppressing his people. The gods create Enkidu, a wild man, to challenge him. They fight, then become companions. Together, they undertake heroic quests, killing Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and slaying the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar. But then Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh faces the reality his god heritage cannot protect him from mortality. The second half of the epic becomes a quest for immortality. Gilgamesh seeks Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the only human ever granted eternal life by the gods. He crosses deserts, passes through mountains of darkness, and crosses the waters of death, obstacles that would kill any ordinary mortal. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, he asks the question that defines the after-flood human condition: how did you find eternal life? Utnapishtim's answer is devastating in its simplicity: you can't. He explains that his immortality was a unique exception granted because he survived the flood, an event the gods swore would never happen again. There is no path, no ritual, no secret. The age when humans could ascend to god status is over. But then Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a test. A plant grows at the bottom of the sea that restores youth. Gilgamesh retrieves it. For a moment, he holds rejuvenation in his hands, proof that the boundary between mortal and immortal might still be crossable. Then a serpent steals the plant while Gilgamesh bathes. It sheds his skin and escapes renewed. Gilgamesh returns home empty-handed. The epic ends not with triumph but with acceptance. Gilgamesh shows his companion the walls of Uruk massive, enduring, a legacy built by human hands. The message is clear: immortality through deeds and memory is all that remains. The gods have closed the gate. This isn't just a story about one king's failed quest. It's a story declaration that the old rules no longer apply. Gilgamesh, Tuathar's divine, couldn't cross back into the realm his ancestors supposedly came from. If he couldn't, no one after him could. The epic functionally locks immortality away. It admits the possibility existed once, then explains why it's gone forever. And it does this through the voice of the only human who ever achieved it, who confirms the door is closed. But Gilgamesh wasn't the only figure described as crossing the boundary between earth and heaven. There were older traditions, broken, strange, and largely forgotten outside specialists, smart people thinking that describe human ascension. The god councils. The most significant is in Medjaranki. Medjaranki appears in the Sumerian king list as the seventh before flood king of Sippar, ruling for 21,000 years. But he also appears in a separate Babylonian text that describes him as the founder of the Bear priesthood, diviners who interpret omens. According to this tradition, the gods Shamash and Adad brought Medjaranki into heaven. They showed him how to interpret oil on water, how to read the liver of sacrificed animals, how to understand the secrets of divination. They gave him the tablet of the gods, taught him sacred knowledge, and then sent him back to earth to establish the priesthood and pass these techniques to his sons. The text is clear, and Medjaranki was admitted to the god council. He received direct instruction. He returned with knowledge humans weren't supposed to have. And then the tradition stops. No later king is described ascending to heaven. No afterflood ruler receives direct god teaching. The boundary closes. Now, here's where the pattern becomes comparative and deeply strange. The biblical book of Enoch describes a nearly identical figure, Enoch, the seventh patriarch before the flood, who walked with God and was taken to heaven without dying. In heaven, angels show him cosmic secrets, explain the calendar, reveal the structure of the universe, and teach him about judgment and the afterlife. He writes it all down, returns briefly to instruct his sons, then ascends permanently. The parallels are too precise to be coincidental. Seventh in the genealogical order, before a fluid figure, ascends to heaven, receives secret knowledge, returns to teach, then the pattern ends. Smart people debate whether the Enoch tradition comes from Medjaranki, or whether both keep a common ancient pattern. But what matters isn't the direction of the influence, it's what the pattern represents. Both traditions describe a moment when the boundary between human and God was crossable, when certain individuals could cross over, receive knowledge, and return. And both traditions place this firmly in the past, before the flood, before the current age, before the world as we know it. After the flood, that access is taken away. Later Mesopotamian kings still claimed God favor. They still performed rituals. They still consulted priests who interpreted omens. But none claimed to have ascended to heaven personally. None described face-to-face instruction from gods. The go-between became absolute. Even the language shifts. Before flood and early after-flood writings describe gods coming down and humans occasionally ascending. Later writings describe gods as distant, unreachable, communicating only through signs that require expert interpretation. The Egyptian tradition keeps a similar boundary. Early pharaohs were described as actual gods in human form. Middle Kingdom pharaohs were described as God-appointed. New Kingdom pharaohs were described as God-favored mortals. The distance increases over time. Greek tradition does the same. The age of heroes figures like Heracles, Perseus, and Achilles born from god-human unions gives way to an age of fully mortal men. The gods withdraw from direct involvement. Olympus becomes remote. Across multiple separate cultures, the pattern repeats. Early writings described crossability between God and human realms. Later writings describe that crossability closing, and the closing is permanent. So what does the Gilgamesh epic actually accomplish in story terms? It takes the last semi-divine king, the final figure who could believably claim partial access to the old world, and sends him on a quest to prove the boundary can still be crossed. And then it shows him failing not because he's weak, but because the rules have changed. Utnapishtim's immortality is a relic. The plant of rejuvenation is stolen. The path to heaven is closed. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and builds walls, solid earthly human monuments. The epic literally grounds him. And with that grounding, the age of semi-divine kingship ends. After Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king lists names rulers with fully human reign lengths. No more partial divinity. No more claims of celestial ancestry. Kingship remains on earth, made legitimate through ritual and memory, but cut off from direct heavenly connection. The Meduranki Enoch traditions do something similar. They keep a memory of humans briefly admitted to God seekers, then clearly state that access is taken away. The knowledge remains passed down through priest family lines, but the source is cut off. Humans can study the techniques, interpret the signs, maintain the rituals, but they can't go back to heaven and ask for updates. The door is closed, and every tradition that mentions it emphasizes the same point: it will not reopen. So here's the question these writings force us to face: if the final message kept across multiple separate traditions is immortality is no longer for you, heaven is closed, the age of God-human contact is over, was it a moral lesson about accepting human limitations? Or was it a memory of something that actually changed, a system that actually withdrew, a form of access or power that was genuinely taken away? If Gilgamesh's story teaching acceptance of death, why frame it as a quest for something that used to be reachable? Why not just say immortality was never possible? If a Meduranki is comparison for the origins of divination, why describe it as knowledge brought from heaven, rather than developed by humans? The writings themselves resist a purely symbolic reading. They insist the boundary was once crossable. They name specific individuals who crossed it. They describe what was found on the other side. And then they explain with consistency across cultures that the crossing is no longer allowed. Which leaves two possibilities: either these are coordinated cultural stories designed to explain why humans feel separated from the divine moral tales justifying the current state of religious go-between, or their memories broken, story-eyes, but keeping the outline of a real transition. A moment when whatever the gods were, elite rulers, external powers, non-human overseers, or something else entirely, stopped allowing direct contact and withdrew into organizational distance. The next question is the hardest: if that withdrawal happened, why? And more importantly, who decided it was necessary? Chapter 8: 3 Factual Explanations for the Fall. In 1976, Zacharias Sitchin published The 12th Planet, arguing that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humans as a slave species. The book became a bestseller, spawning decades of alternative history content, documentaries, and online communities, convinced that ancient Mesopotamian writings keep records of alien contact. Mainstream smartperson thinking dismissed Sitchin's work immediately, and for good reason. His translations were often incorrect. His astronomy claims didn't match Sumerian cosmology, and his interpretations ignored context. But here's what's interesting: Sitchin didn't invent the question. He just gave it the most sensational possible answer, because the question itself is legitimate. Who or what were the Anunnaki? The term appears throughout Mesopotamian literature in creation epics, business writings, hymns, and king lists. Sometimes it refers to the great gods collectively. Sometimes it refers to a specific group of deities associated with the earth and underworld, contrasted with the Igigi, the younger gods. Sometimes it's used generally for the god council. But the writings themselves never define the term with precision. And that lack of clarity has allowed interpretations ranging from conservative academic agreement to fringe speculation. So let's examine the facts fairly, not to prove any single interpretation correct, but to see what each one can and cannot explain. Interpretation A: the Anunnaki as story language for power. This is the mainstream smartperson position, and it's grounded in decades of careful writing analysis. In this reading, the Anunnaki aren't beings. They're a story device, a way ancient Mesopotamians expressed the idea of cosmic order, political right rule, and social hierarchy. The Anunnaki decided means the established order determined. Kingship came down from heaven means political power. Claims God origin. The advantage of this interpretation is that it doesn't require actual belief in gods. It treats story as theology, theology as belief system, and belief system as the cultural language through which ancient societies made power structures legitimate. Under this framework, the fall of the Anunnaki is simply cultural evolution. As societies became more complex, theology evolved from actual God presence to abstract God principles. Early city-states needed immediate God power to justify centralized control. Later empires needed flexible theological systems that could incorporate conquered people's gods without collapsing internal consistency. So the gods fade because theology matures. God rule becomes symbolic rule. The flood represents social upheaval or environment crisis storyized into cosmic drama. And the transition from before flood to after flood kingship reflects the real transition from early religion-ruled city-states to later non-religious monarchies. This interpretation explains most of the writing facts. It accounts for why God wars mirror human political conflicts. It explains why reign lengths shrink as real records become more reliable. It clarifies why later kings claim God favor, but not God presence. But it struggles with one detail: the writings themselves never admit they're symbolic. Mesopotamian writers didn't write the Anunnaki, by which we mean political power. They wrote the Anunnaki decided. They didn't. Right kingship came down from heaven is a metaphor for right rule. They wrote it as fact, and they kept that fact across centuries, even when it contradicted their lived political reality. If the Anunnaki were always just symbolic, why maintain the Marduk story so strictly? Why not evolve the language to match the evolved theology? Interpretation B: the Anunnaki as remembered elites or ruling layer. This interpretation takes the writings more really not as descriptions of gods, but as distorted memories of real human rulers. In this reading, the Anunnaki were an elite class, possibly priest-kings, possibly a conquering group, possibly an early ruling family that established the first centralized states in Mesopotamia. Over hundreds of years, their real reality was storyized into God status. The facts for this come from comparative real analysis. We know how real figures become storyized. King Arthur was likely a Romano-British warlord. By the medieval period, he's pulling swords from stones and leading knights in shining armor. Genghis Khan was a ruthless military strategist. Within generations, he's described as God-appointed with supernatural powers. If the Anunnaki were early rulers whose reigns were recorded in exaggerated terms either through deliberate propaganda or through oral tradition, distortion, then the fall becomes explainable as political collapse. City living stressed early centralized systems. Irrigation required coordination beyond small kin groups. Conflict over resources led to warfare. Ecological pressures sold, flooding, drought destabilized food supplies. The ruling elite couldn't maintain control. Revolutions replaced them, or they simply broke up as centralized power dissolved into competing city-states. The flood becomes a real environment disaster, severe enough to destroy the old political order entirely. When civilization rebuilt, the new rulers couldn't claim continuity with the old system. So they claimed God descent from a storyized past instead. This interpretation accounts for why the transition feels political, why God wars mirror state conflicts, why population growth triggers crisis, why after-flood kingship behaves like normal real monarchy. But it also requires assuming massive distortion occurred quickly. Early dynastic Mesopotamia is only a few hundred years removed from the supposed before-flood period. Yet already the Anunnaki are described in fully God terms. How does a human ruling class become gods in cultural memory that fast? Interpretation C: the Anunnaki as non-human overseers. This is the interpretation Sitchin popularized, though versions of it came before him and continue in various forms online and in alternative history communities. The core claimed the Anunnaki were really non-human beings, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or otherwise, who ruled early humans, then withdrew or were overthrown. Supporters point to specific writing details: the Sumerian king lists some possibly long reigns. The phrase kingship came down from heaven, the Atrahasis epic's description of humans created to serve God work needs, and Medjuranki's ascension to heaven, the sudden closure of God-human contact. They argue these aren't metaphors. Their records distorted by time and retelling, yes, but keeping the outline of real events involving non-human entities. Mainstream smart person thinking rejects this interpretation entirely, and for good reason. There's no physical facts of extraterrestrial contact. The astronomy claims made by ancient astronaut believers don't match what the writings actually say. Most alternative interpretations rely on mistranslations or cherry-picked quotes removed from context. But here's what's worth noting: the interpretation persists not because of facts, but because the writings feel like they're describing something concrete. The business-like tone of the king lists, the business precision of Atrahasis, the detailed descriptions of God councils and hierarchies. The writings don't read like pure story. They read like records, even if the events recorded seem impossible. And that tension drives the entire alternative history industry. People sense something real beneath the story, even if they lack the tools to extract it responsibly. So what's the social phenomenon here? Why does the ancient astronaut interpretation remain popular despite smart people rejection? Because the mainstream interpretation that these are purely symbolic stories doesn't satisfy the psychological need for coherence between tone and content. If the writers wrote like accountants, people want the content to match the tone. It's the same reason conspiracy theories persist. Official explanations feel incomplete. So alternative explanations fill the gap, even if they require extraordinary assumptions. But the persistence of the interpretation doesn't make it true. It just reveals that the question remains open in popular consciousness even if academia considers it closed. So what can we actually conclude? We can't prove who or what the Anunnaki were. The facts allow multiple interpretations, each explaining some details while struggling with others. But here's what we can ask instead: a sharper, more really grounded question, regardless of whether the Anunnaki were symbolic constructs, storyized elites, or something else entirely. What did humans do that made the old order impossible to maintain? Because every interpretation agrees on one fact: something changed permanently. Early writings describe centralized God power. Later writings describe broken up human power. Early stories assume gods rule directly. Later stories assume gods observe from distance. The transition is written down. The direction is consistent. And the writings themselves frame it as collapse, not evolution. So whether the collapse was belief-based, political, or real, humans emerged from it autonomous, self-governing, no longer managed from above. And the question becomes, was that liberation or exile? The final chapter won't answer that, but it will frame why the question still matters, and what the silence of the gods means for a species learning to rule itself. Chapter 9: The only thing we can say with confidence: the gods become memory. In the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, catalog number IM 58453, sits a clay cylinder from the reign of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon before the Persian conquest in 539 BC. The writing describes Nabonidus restoring ancient temples, seeking the original foundation deposits left by kings who ruled 1,500 years earlier. He writes, "I sought the ancient foundation platform which the kings who preceded me had built, but I could not find it. The gods did not show me the place." This is 17 centuries after the Sumerian king list was first put together, 25 centuries after the before-flood kings supposedly ruled. And the ruling monarch of Mesopotamia's greatest empire is searching for physical facts of a past he can't access and admitting the gods no longer guide him to it. The gods have become keepers of memory, not doers of history. And Nabonidus, ruler of millions, consults ancient writings and decipherable things. Earns like a modern smart person, because direct God instruction is no longer available. That's the end point. Now let's trace how we arrived there. The pattern across Mesopotamian literature is unmistakable: distance increases, contact decreases, presence becomes absence. Early Sumerian writings from the 3rd millennium BC describe gods who walk through cities, inspect fields, judge arguments, and punish offenders directly. The cylinder seals from this period show gods and humans in the same visual plane, interacting, negotiating, witnessing. By the 2nd millennium BC, Babylonian writings describe gods who communicate through dreams, omens, and priest interpretation. They remain active but gone between. Kings still claim God favor, but they don't claim God presence. By the 1st millennium BC, Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian writings describe gods as cosmic principles, moral abstractions, and ritual recipients. They're invoked, honored, and feared, but they no longer come down to intervene. Even the language shifts from "the God commanded me to" "I acted in accordance with the will of the God." The grammar changes from active God action to passive human interpretation of God preference. This isn't just religious evolution. It's written down business transformation. Temple archives from Ur, Lagash, and Nippur keep thousands of business tablets. Early ones record distributions at the command of the god Enlil. Later ones record distributions for the temple of Enlil. The god transitions from active manager to passive recipient of offerings. Ritual becomes more elaborate while god responsiveness decreases. Temples grow larger, priesthoods become more specialized, festivals become more complex. But the writings stop describing gods appearing at these events. Instead, they describe priests performing rituals in the hope of God approval. It's the professionalization of God access. And professionalization always creates distance. So what happened? Not in story terms, but in real, writable down terms. Humans expanded. Populations that numbered in the thousands during the early Ur period grew to hundreds of thousands by the old Babylonian period. Cities that covered a few dozen acres expanded to cover square miles. Irrigation networks that served single settlements became regional systems spanning multiple city-states. The scale exceeded anything manageable by direct personal power. Even human kings couldn't rule that way anymore. They needed business organizations, provincial governors, written law codes, and standing armies. If the gods were ever real ruling entities, whether storyized elites, remembered rulers, or something else, they faced the same scaling problem. States hardened. Political power that once flowed from God command became enforced through military power. The transition from early dynastic city-states to the Akkadian Empire to the Babylonian Empire was violent, competitive, and practical. God right rule mattered for propaganda, but territorial control depended on armies, not rituals. Priesthoods professionalized. The go-betweens between God and human power became a distinct class with organizational interests. They controlled access to God communication, interpretation of omens, performance of rituals, and education of writers. Their power came from the gods being distant enough to require interpretation, but present enough to remain relevant. Wars multiplied. Mesopotamian history from 2900 to 500 BC is nearly continuous warfare, city against city, empire against empire, family against family. The cosmic order the early writings describe as stable and God-commanded became impossible to reconcile with the chaos of actual political reality. So theology adapted. God wars explained human wars. God hierarchy mirrored political hierarchy. And God distance explained why the old stories of direct rule no longer matched lived experience. Here's what we can say with confidence without claiming to know what the Anunnaki were. The writings keep a transition from immediate to God-between power, from direct rule to symbolic writer rule, from presence to memory. Early writings assume gods are here. Later writings assume gods are there. And the dividing line writing-wise, time-wise, and idea-wise is the flood. Whether the flood was real environment disaster, metaphor for political collapse, or both, it marks the point where one system ended and another began. The before-flood world operated under rules the after-flood world no longer recognized, reigns measured in thousands of years, kingship coming down from heaven directly, God councils making decisions that humans simply enacted. The after-flood world operates under rules we recognize: human lifespan, monarchies, fought over political power, organizational religion, professional priesthoods, and the constant need to make power legitimate through reference to an earlier, pure age. So here's the safest, most factual way to frame it: humans caused the fall. Humans expanded beyond the capacity of the old system, whatever that system was, to manage them. Population growth, territorial expansion, technological development, and social complexity created conditions where centralized God rule, whether real or symbolic, couldn't function. The world no longer required the same kind of power story. Or perhaps it no longer tolerated it. And the response wasn't God punishment. It was God withdrawal. The gods as concept, as memory, as whatever they originally were, moved back into ritual, theology, and organizational go-between. They became stories people told to explain why kingship existed, why laws mattered, why rituals must be performed correctly. But they stopped being present. Even if we assume the most conservative interpretation that the Anunnaki were never anything but story language for political power, the fall still happened. Because what collapsed wasn't just a set of characters and stories. It was a model of ruling. Early Mesopotamian political theory assumed power came down from outside and above. Late Mesopotamian political theory assumed power came up from below and was made legitimate by reference to above. That's a fundamental reorganization, not just of who rules, but of why anyone has the right to rule at all. And the writings keep that reorganization as trauma. The flood isn't celebrated as liberation. It's described as disaster. The after-flood world isn't framed as improvement. It's framed as lessening. Kings no longer live for thousands of years. Humans no longer ascend to heaven. The gates are closed. Something was lost. Even if we can't name what it was, the writings insist something was lost. Nabonidus, searching for foundation stones the gods won't reveal. That's where the story ends, with a king who rules millions, commands armies, controls the greatest empire of his age, and can't find a building's original foundation, because the gods no longer answer. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, became memory, then tradition, then the things. And humans inherited a world where power had to be justified rather than delivered, where kings ruled by force and law rather than God appointment, where the heavens stayed closed and the earth vast, wild, ungovernable belonged entirely to us. So here's the question the Mesopotamian writings keep copied across thousands of years, hidden in king lists and flood epics and creation stories. If the gods became stories the moment humans learned to rule themselves, was that progress? Or was it the first exile from a forgotten world we were never supposed to leave?